So thank you all for agreeing to come on here and talk about leadership and about harm that happens in leadership and how we can better embody and integrate leadership and what that even means from each of our perspectives. So thank you for being here.
You're welcome. I'm excited. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah. So this was sparked, for those of you listening, this was sparked by an experience I had with someone in a container, a leader in a container that it was an unpleasant experience. And it was like someone who purported to like practice intimacy and attunement in relationships, and in relationship with me was absolutely not attuned and not willing to do the deeper repair work that he purports to sell and practice. And so that's really a matter of embodiment and integrity, right? Integrity is about embodiment. So I was wanting to hear from you sort of what that sparked for you and why you wanted to come on here and talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm processing a sort of a similar experience with a one-on-one coach who is like brilliant at sales, just brilliant, right? And then the actual embodiment of staying in the fire, right? Is I think that's a phrase that I think of a lot. Like, it is uncomfortable for our animal selves, our raw emotions, and our egos to be like to mess it up in some way, or even if it's not intentional. There's a difference between intention and impact often, but to not own the impact and then like stay with it so that humans can actually grow together. That's one of the tenets that I'm living my life by, is that the purpose of all relationships is growth. And the benefit then is love, right? In our culture, we think we should just get love automatically. And so we don't stay in the fire when things like get really, activated, as they will in any sort of like deeply transformational work. I think that just comes with the territory. But that's like my commitment, is staying in the fire. And do I do that perfectly? No. That it's the process of it, right?
Right.
And so I can definitely have compassion for that, the scared aspect of that person that's like, or they're just resistant. I don't have the energy.
Right.
Return of energy. I'm not going to get actual money or clients or get more, it just, there can be something sort of, it's just like a shutting down of the energy. Like, I just, and that can be really painful for the person on the other end.
Yes.
Like, recreate some early childhood imprints of like, there's been rupture without repair so many times for so many of us.
Yes. And I really love what you said. Like, yeah, nobody does this perfectly. And that I feel a lot of the intimacy work happens in the repair process. Right. All of the healing, a lot of the healing happens in the repair process, when we're able to say, you know what, I really messed up and I was totally out of integrity. I mean, I just did it last week with a partner where I'm just like, wow, I really lost sight of myself. And these are all the ways where I betrayed myself, and I went on, like, there were 2 or 3 things where I was like, yeah, and that hurt me, but it also hurt our relationship. And it's like, and there was this opening of like, oh, I see you better and I see what you need and want even more now, and I can like be with you in that. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of systemic issues that we can look to as well, and that does not, like, I'm not saying that negates the personal responsibility, because it absolutely doesn't, but at least, so I'm in America. I'm in Los Angeles, California, and like I grew up in America, middle of the country America, so even more like systemic like oppression in various ways there, right? So again, like I'm not saying it negates the personal responsibility, but because it is so much a part of our overarching culture here in the West, at least for Westerners, part of the embodiment, if we want to create these brave spaces, if we want to actually live the truth of what we're speaking to, requires deconditioning from these systemic systems, from these systems. Otherwise, we are just going to continue these actions of harm.
Absolutely. Those systems live inside of us, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I talk about attachment is like happens in our family of origin, but we also have like attachment wounds or intimacy wounds that are connected to systems of disempowerment and oppression,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we
Yeah.
perpetuate those in our relationship, right? There's like, it's like a nested model of, right, of
Right.
attachment. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of these systems we are so unaware of, like especially when it comes to intimacy, like we are taught to be very codependent when it comes to romance specifically.
Yeah.
And especially if you have like this romantic connection, and I see this too even in the non-monogamous communities, it still trumps oftentimes, you know, again, if you haven't done the work, it still trumps every other relationship once you get into that romantic partnership or partnerships. And it's there's a lot of work. There's a lot of things to decondition from. And I mean, even this like conflict avoidance, like nobody's taught, we're all taught, again, in the West, that conflict is bad and it needs to be avoided at all costs, which increases people pleasing, which increases, you know, all of these other like problematic behaviors.
Right. And when you think about like when I know that when I'm in conflict with someone, like when I have to bring a grievance, like, yeah, I'm nervous. I can feel my nervous system activation. I could feel my fear of having the person retaliate, all that kind of stuff. And when a grievance is brought towards me, you know, from a client or from somebody that I'm really wanting to serve, like, yeah, I can feel how scared I get. And it goes back to what I think, like what Fauna said, what you said was so the capacity to stay in the fire, like to hold the flare of whatever activation is happening, whatever aspects are like, right? All the fear that is arising around losing something, being left, you know, some bad shit happening, you know, being rejected, etc. Is like, can we hold all of those pieces and still stay in listening and hearing the other person while also holding like, right? And naming, I can feel how scared I am as I hear you sharing with me what you didn't like about our last interaction. Yeah.
I think too, like there's a lot of work that needs to be done both systemically and individually with like everybody around, like deconditioning from perfectionism, because
Yeah.
if in the overarching system, especially if you're coming from the place of like being an expert, which I don't love using that word, because I don't love hierarchy, but like if you're coming from that place like as an expert, like we've been taught, and Fauna, I don't know you as well as I know Isha, but like, you know, we have graduate degrees, and like even in like the graduate school system, we're taught like, no, if you're the expert, you need to be on top of your shit. You need to be perfect. You need to know exactly what you're talking about before you say anything. So there's like so many different systems at play. Of course, just like the fear and nervous system activation of conflict in general, because nobody loves it, but it's necessary for life, for relationships, for intimacy. But then you pile on top of that this idea that you're supposed to know better, you're supposed to be perfect, you're supposed to be the expert, and you know, whatever else has gotten triggered. And then that's where you get this like, oh, okay, well, I have to be perfect, I have to be the expert, so you're clearly wrong and I'm not taking any responsibility for my piece in this relationship, right?
Yeah. And when we get into that thinking, I think it also perpetuates that whole, like, even how we think about leadership, you know, and we tend to think of leadership. We have to decondition ourselves from thinking about leadership as something that's hierarchical, as something that is, like that leadership has to be something like big, because we are in our leadership all the time. Like how we show up to whatever relationship we're in, that is our leadership. That is, it's an energetic experience, right? Like being able to show up as your full self in your humanity, and giving other people permission to do the same, and supporting people and feeling safe in your energy. Like for me, that's really the deeper meaning of leadership. And we often lose sight of that because we're into this, like, oh, it has to look this certain way, or I have to be an expert. It was like, no, you get to be a full-ass human, and you get to be fallible, and you get to, course correct and repair. And I feel like that's what we need to normalize as part of, like, this is what leadership really looks like, and vulnerability, etc. Yeah.
And for me, a lot, as a somatic sex educator and erotic blueprints coach, and a lot of, I feel like in sexuality, a lot of what we play out there is like a training ground for how we relate with power, right? And I really think everyone in some aspect is kinky. Like there's inherent in a coach client relationship. I've been loving reframing domination and submission as like leader and follower, which is less hierarchical and more of a relational dance. And the follower gets something from that exchange. Someone who has gone before, who's trained, or like, even, yeah, and like an example in like the military, the people who are training are learning to relinquish their personal will and follow the will of the leader, right? And there's something, I think, around the power dynamic of that needs to be like really clear, that someone is the facilitator of a space, they hold a power, and there's like a deep responsibility to the well-being of people who are like opening themselves to that experience, to the learning there. And I don't know where to take it from there, but that's been something I've been just recalibrating my mind toward, is it's not like there's power on both sides.
Yes.
And it's just about being clear about the roles and being able to switch in those energies as needed in life.
Yeah. What is that what that's reminding me of is like when you're facilitating a group, for example, like there are those energy exchanges in group work as well, where you are sort of the supposed leader, you are there like holding the space, and yet like when the group chooses something, or when the group is going in a specific direction, your leadership is about following the energy of the group, right? Like leading by following. And so there is that energy dance that happens there in spaces as well. Yeah, I love that.
I think it's like deconditioning from that hierarchy that is so inherent in our world today. And it's I love Kink. Fauna, I'm a love sex relationship coach, and I'm talking about kink all this month in my group, but really like what I come back to always is like having those conversations about like what that dynamic is going to look like prior to your play, because I find that there's this overarching idea that if you're like a dom, you're just always in charge, or if you're a sub, you're always submitting, and that's not how it works. And there's so much harm that can happen if you don't have those conversations beforehand, or this awareness of like how those power dynamics play out. And I think that there is a direct link in terms of like how we view power in overarching society and like politics, yes, but also like in like these smaller containers that we have as like leaders, right, as coaches, as whatever it is, managers, whatever it is that you do. But even just having that awareness, and like Isha was saying, that flow between following and leading, because like topping from below is a thing. It's a thing that I do a lot. And at the end of the day, right? Oftentimes in these like power dynamics, like specifically in the kink space, right? So it's a little different, it's a little more nuanced and complex when you bring it outside of the kink space. But like in the kink space, like oftentimes the submissive is the one who has all the power, because it is a huge responsibility to essentially be in charge, to dominate somebody.
Absolutely. And how would you talk about, you talked earlier about like how we relate to power. And how do you define power? Like what's real power to you?
I have been bandying around that question for a while now, because one of the concepts that I'm aware of, right, is like soft power. So that's power through like influence, media, entertainment, etc.
Yes.
And that is really something I've been digging into more, and it has brought up a lot of questions about what power looks like and what that means. Because I think, at least in America, like we're often taught that power is that hard power, that domination, that submission, that getting people to do what you want, that manipulation and exploitation. And I I feel like for me, like that power would be more like what Fauna was talking about, that like, you know, leading and following and allowing that to be fluid. Because if you take away the hierarchy, it lends itself more to like community care, where everybody has power. It's just different power, right? So I think all of us work in the realm of like sex love relationships, and that is where we hold like expertise or power, or where we can lead, right? But if you ask me about, I don't know, like social media analytics or like graphic design, like I have no power there. I don't know how to do that shit. So like of course it's to my benefit to I think to succeed. I think I'm using the right word. I'm very like COVID brain right now, so hopefully that's right. But to like succeed my power to my graphic designer and say, I don't like, you're the expert, you're the person who has gone to school for this, who has learned these things. Like you take charge, and then my job is to just like say, yes, I love this. No, I don't love this. Can we make a couple changes? Right? And that I feel is like true leadership, is just letting people do the things that they're good at.
So like the distribution of power in a way, like
Yeah.
really like in that exchange, or maybe reciprocity of just like, yes, you do this, I do this for you, or you do this for me, and we kind of like, we get all of our needs met, and we get to these shared goals by each person bringing their unique medicine into the mix.
Yes. Yeah. And really relinquishing control.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's the opposite of how we learn what power is, right?
Yeah.
Relinquishing control versus like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yummy. Mhm.
What about for you, Fauna? How do you define power? What's power to you?
Yeah, I think that power can come from different. What I'm engaging in a system of up level communication with my mentor Tanya Stevens of the Progressive Love Academy, and it's really shifting. I'm aware in Western culture we don't have a language for who's speaking or who's acting. So we have our raw animal self that's really not logical. Like children are in their raw emotions and are just starting to develop an ego. And we have our ego that's like, this is right, that's wrong. I have the ego came up with the term like nervous system, and like very hierarchical, black and white. And so like egoic power, is rigid. I think it's like I'm hooked. The ego wants to have things fixed. And so when I'm in that state of power, it's like I do want to control. And I'm not very likely to want to like let things flow dynamically. And so what I've really been cultivating is a transcendent power or immanent power, right? It's like from the vast self. I don't really like the term higher self because I'm like, it's everywhere. Like I don't directionality. But like that state of power is I think what I hear Kari speaking to. It's like yeah, like what's in service to the whole. And because I know I'm part of the whole, that's the way vast self thinks, is like, it's deeply inter-sovereign, interdependent. I'm part of the whole.
Yes.
My well-being serves your well-being. Your well-being serves my well-being. So it's a relational dance. And, and that can get really, then the ego in the coach is like, but I'm the coach. I have to lead. I have to tell you what to do. Right. And it's like, my most powerful experiences have been when that can really flow, and there's I get like full body tingles, and both people become channels for their deepest knowing, and it's fucking powerful. It's amazing.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
power. That's when
Yeah.
I feel it in my whole body. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I feel like, especially as like coaches or therapists, like we have to let go of this idea that like we know what to tell people what to do or like how to do it, because I'm like and I know some newer coaches as well. I'm like, coaching is not advice giving. I don't tell anyone what to do. I just ask them a lot of questions, and then if they ask for it, I give them like what my experience was. But because we're all so different, there's no one right way ever. That's all I have to say about that. But Isha, I would love to hear, what your concept of power is.
Yeah. I often think of power because my work is expressive. I do
Mhm.
expressive body work. And so I feel like our power is in what we emanate energetically, like in our beingness, in our authenticity. And I love the word that you used, Fauna, inter-sovereign. Sovereignty is a word that's really important to me because I grew up in a sort of in a household that was emotionally manipulative, and so I got often like pulled in lots of different directions, and to be pulled inward into my own wisdom and into my
Mm.
own body as sort of like home base is really, really important to me, to be very connected to my needs and my desires and to my internal boundaries and all that kind of stuff. That is really, and where I feel like I am aware of all of these aspects of myself, be it ego or be it sort of this expansive self, that I can show all parts of that. Like I have a relationship to my shadow, and that relationship is one that is compassionate. And I can share my shadow in my partnerships, or like having a hold of my whole self and being able to bring that into my relationships. That I feel like that's really powerful, and like that is like our beingness is a form of permission giving for other people to be in theirs. And it's just like, if I can express all of who I am, then you can express all of who you are. But we can do it from a place of where it is inter-sovereign. Like it isn't just about me and my expression, but about like, I'm also wanting to experience your expression. How does our expression come together? Like what happens when we bring it together? And I don't know, it is very deeply relational for me as well, is how that power is shared. How like I love being in the, like when I'm working with a client, I love being the person in the background being like, yeah, go, 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 because I love seeing people flourish and yeah, just express themselves, express whatever truth is inside of them. So that for me is powerful. That is real power. Yeah. And so going back to sort of the original intention of this conversation about like leadership, I remember, Kari, you recently did a workshop on like doing no harm or reducing harm. Can you
Mhm.
share a little bit about that? Because I feel like that goes in well with what we're talking about here, about like that awareness of like how these systemic pieces come into our relational dynamics, the subtleties of it. And you found out you had begun to talk about energetics, like the awareness of energy. So like let's bring that together.
Yeah, so the workshop that I held recently was very on the nose. It was how not to perpetuate systems of oppression in love and dating and relationships, right? Because there's a lot. So I am non-binary, queer, transracial, transnational adoptee from Taiwan. There's a lot. I hold multiple marginalized identities, and I am in partnership with a cis het straight white, or yeah, no, yeah, cis het white male. Um, and it is so apparent to me, and this is where I have to keep my ego, in check. But like it is so apparent to me where like these systems of privilege come into play and in our relationship. And that's not to say like privilege doesn't mean he's a bad person, but there are just things that like his life experience and how he comports himself in the world is just so different because of how he's treated, right? He's very attractive. He's like 6'2" and like 250 pounds. Like, so he's a large dude. And there are certain things, just in the way he takes up space and the way that he even like walks our dogs, right, in our neighborhood. Like, it's a totally different experience. And sometimes he is unaware that like my experience is different. And again, that's not necessarily through like any fault of his own because we're all coming from our lived experience. And also like the more that I mean in our relationship, the more that I can make him aware of like how my experience differs from his, um the more empathy and understanding he can have around the way that I move in the world and why, I might not take up as much space or what, or like why it's not okay for me to walk down a dark alleyway in the middle of the night with our dogs, things like that. And again, like no fault on him, but I wanted to make sure that people have a resource where they can do that work on their own. And of course, like he's doing that work on his end in a different way in terms of like decolonization and like dismantling systemic oppression. But sometimes I think it's harder to bring that into the micro, right? Especially because we do have this very monolithic way of seeing, like we're taught to see the world in a very monolithic way. So we see I'm doing this work of dismantling systemic oppression. I'm doing this decolonization work for the greater system, right? The greater world. But are you also doing it with yourself? Are you also doing it in your micro systems, right? In your interpersonal, like your intimate interpersonal relationships? And I think that's where it's so easy to drop the ball because we are not aware of it and we don't think about it, right?
Mhm,
Even in
mhm.
like kink spaces, non-monogamous spaces, like oftentimes in like different kink communities I see a lot of like politics don't belong in kink, and like they're talking like
Mm.
on a broad sense, right? But that includes like social justice, decolonization work, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, look, like I don't hang out in public communal kink spaces because as like an Asian American femme, like I am hypersexualized and I am fetishized without my consent. And so that's why it's so important that we I mean, like, I don't think Biden belongs in the kink space. Maybe it does if that's your kink. I'm not really sure, right? And I'm sure, like, on a more like macro level, it might actually really be important for us to talk about that stuff, right? But like on the micro level, at the very least, like there needs to be this like look at an awareness of like how systemic oppression affects these communities. Because I don't think it like there's a reason why a lot of kink spaces are like mainly white, because I know I'm not the only melanated person who
Mhm.
has been hypersexualized or fetishized without my consent.
Yeah, yeah, and I know of have Black friends in the kink community who don't go to white kink spaces, like they go
Hmm.
to kink spaces that are set aside for melanated folks. Yeah,
Yeah,
'cause there's
yeah,
just a different dynamic there. Yeah.
totally. And again, I don't think anyone's doing it out of malice. I just think they're unaware. And it's also like it becomes more nuanced and complex because like we're literally in a fetish space, right?
Mhm. Yeah. So what, before I go to you, Fauna, Kari, what are some of the ways that we perpetuate harm in dating and relationships? Like what some of the subtleties?
So like again, and I always say like, I'm a big proponent of being self-led. So I always say it starts with you. So really looking at your internal biases, really looking at um, how you move through the world and how that might be different from, like I said, my partner is a cis het white male. How he moves in the world as one of the most privileged people, in fact, the most privileged person in society, right? Category in society is completely different from how I move in the world. Even looking at like who or what features we're attracted to. And that I think specifically, and again, nuanced and complex, far more than we can go into in this like one podcast episode, but like why are you only attracted to people with like big lips and big eyes, or why are you only attracted to like light skinned people? Like, yeah, attraction is just whatever you're attracted to, but a lot of that comes from how we were conditioned, where we live,
Absolutely.
like how we were brought up, the
Beauty
overarching
norms.
system. Yeah,
Yeah.
like because I mean, especially growing up in the Midwest, even having lived in Los Angeles, which is far more diverse for like almost a decade now, like it's still so easy for me to think that like Eurocentric features are like the most attractive features. And I don't even necessarily think that's true, but even in like, yes, we have more diversity in terms of like our media and entertainment and like advertising and stuff. But even then, like those melanated people still have very Eurocentric features.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Kari.
You're welcome.
And what about for you, Fauna? You talked about the subtlety. You were getting into the subtlety of energetics when we were aware of energy in leadership or even interacting and understanding like when we do harm.
Yeah. Um, I'm just coming out of a 5-day retreat, doing work around the orgasmic arc, which is this just the way that energy moves in a conversation, in a movement experience, in lovemaking, right? Like the foundation of that is safety, and that's what differentiates performative sex or performative, connection, is like when we're actually really dropped into ourselves, like that creates safety for the other person to express authentically, and vice versa. So I think a lot about how the level of safety in a container is dependent on the level of attunement and the ability to track. So like I know Isha, this experience that you had, I was in the same community and had an experience, and it was like a lingam massage workshop on Zoom, and I got a direct message from a male, a cock-bodied participant saying, "Do you want to energetically like guide my hand in lingam massage?" And I was like, "Whoa! I've never met this person. I don't like," and there was no container set, around that, and there was like my video was off the whole time. So that was just only based on just like my name and my Zoom picture. So there was no attunement, right? It was
Wow.
just like this person just acting from an impulse to get something. And I was actually like there with my partner. Like I would, just wasn't in that space. And, the person who was organizing and facilitating this, like essentially just gave lip service around, I talked to that person. And so I think a lot about how we're conditioned to, like, we don't feel safe in our own bodies. Our caregivers mostly have generations of trauma that didn't imprint that to us. Like, and the way that when we're not feeling safe in the world, we just perpetuate that, because then we can't actually, if we're not safe in our own bodies, we can't connect and attune to another.
Right.
And so one of the edgier things of this 5-day workshop, where, I mean, I've known these humans for 10 of us, like for months, doing work around safety, building that foundation, embodying that. And when we all came together and had that, there was a certain point we were doing body work on each other where like it was almost a trance flow state of knowing. It was, you know, guiding people through cathartic releases, through moving energy, you know, into the whole arc. And I knew exactly what they needed to hear, and I didn't have to ask consent. Like, it happened this morning with my roommate. She started crying, and like I just knew I just went over and held her. And I think that we get really rigid about boundaries too. There's like the polarity of like, we need protocols to the extent that we're in attunement. And then there's a certain place where we get to actually flow dynamically. There was a beautiful essay on decolonizing kink. And it's in essence like that's all arisen from a complete lack of attunement. These protocols and container setting, right? And if we actually like really deeply were safe in safety together, like we would know where the energy needed to go. And so I'm just in this dance. It's like, it's threatening to my ego. I'm like, oh, but what if someone who hears this, like, that they don't necessarily need consent if they can feel it, could take that as, you know, an invitation to do harm, right? And that's where integrity and safety within the self comes in. So it's like a very emergent thing I'm in now. Like, it was a new capacity.
Yeah.
To, like, feel what the invitation was and wasn't, and like adjust my energy and action accordingly.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's vulnerable to be in that.
Totally. And I can see how listeners might be like, oh, but we need the protocols. And I agree, we need them to the extent that we're attuned. And your share, Fauna, is reminding me of an exercise I did in an energy class that I was in with my teacher, and where we were standing apart from one another, and we had to like take steps forward only when we felt the person was inviting us, and they were inviting us just by standing there. And we would step forward, and then we would check in, and then we would step forward again. And it was like, when we really tuned in, it was all consensual, but it was happening energetically, and it was happening in silence. And we needed to really slow the fuck down in order to be able to feel in that deeply. And the truth is that we we don't tend to slow down that slowly, right? That much, to be able to really feel and sort of look into a person's eyes and notice like the subtle signs of fear, or the right, when the body sort of pulls back a little bit, or, you know, body language. And yeah, so that is and that goes back to, Kari, what you shared around kink, and around like the leadership and follower, and being able to, like, the leader has to be like inside of the follower. They have to be so inside their animal bodies to be able to sort of track what is happening, where's desire, where's need, where's nervous system, what's happening inside of them. Yeah.
This is why I very rarely dom. It's
a lot of work.
Huge responsibility. It's a lot of work. I have enough responsibility in my personal life. I want to give that up later. No, but again, right? This is where the internal decolonization work comes in. This is where the awareness of how you move and how you're treated in the world comes in. Because like yes, Fauna and Isha to the energetics, and also I feel like currently like the energetics have kind of taken over this more like strategic logistical way of being, and we really need both, because you cannot create safety when there's no container. And if you're not aware of like your privilege in the world, you're not necessarily going to see like that, you know, your melanated partner might be people pleasing or might not want to do, but also I feel like we always have to be aware of these power dynamics in the world. I mean, even from, you know, as a coach, if I'm servicing, a cis het white male, there's a power dynamic there, as there's a multiple power dynamics, right? Because on some level, um, my cis het white male client will have power over me in some ways because of the privilege that he holds in the world. And I also hold power because I'm his coach, right? Like, so you have to be aware of all of those multiple power dynamics in these relationships, again, whether it's kink or whatever else you're doing. But yeah, you do have to be aware, and in that, decolonize leadership.
And decolonizing, right? Because it's like an
Right.
ongoing process.
Yeah.
Like I think a lot of what happens in spiritual communities, my observation, and this is not new information, but there's a lot of bypassing that happens where it's like, oh, I'm done with my work, I'm finished, I've ascended, and
Mm-hmm.
there isn't sort of that ongoing examination of how ego is showing up. And that's precisely when ego wants to show up, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm done with my work. And it's like, no, it's ongoing. I'm constantly opening to more of myself. I'm constantly recognizing where I've like made missteps and where I've, where I can go back and do better and show up
Mm-hmm.
in ways that are more truthful or more in integrity and alignment with who I say I be.
Yeah.
So that is definitely ongoing work. Yeah. Well, any final thoughts before we end today? Anything
I
that's like burning?
I read
Any,
something recently, and if I remember who it is, I'll send it over to you for show notes. But this person wrote, spirituality is the experience of being human. And then I think I might have added on, and the experience of being human is all of it, right? Like all of these aspects of ourselves that we've been talking about. And
yeah.
so yeah, it just, when you were talking about how, like, there's people in the spiritual world who say like I've ascended or I'm healed or I've finished, that's really, like, I think coming back to the thing of spirituality is really the human existence, and the human existence is making mistakes and fucking up and being
Yes.
imperfect.
Yes, absolutely. The messy, being in the mess. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And having to pick up and do the repair work. I think like forgiveness of self and other people, and grieving losses and all of that is like, that is the richness of being human and being in our emotions and being able to express them and share them. That is like, yeah, that is where all the richness is.
Yeah. Yeah, one of my mentors, Susanna Barkataki,
Oh,
has said, grief is an act of resistance. And that's just so potent for me.
yeah. Yeah. Especially when I think about like ancestors and how many were not able to grieve, right? It was just kind of like, no, we need to keep going. It was survival based, and grieving is sort of like this privilege that we have now where we are more emotionally literate and fluent. And it's like, oh yeah, we're doing grief work way back into the generations and forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Fauna? Any final thoughts? Any sort of like thing that is like pressing to share?
Yeah, I just want to follow on that thread around grief and the messiness of being human, right? To really be able to attune and feel like the impact that we have when we do mess up, right? And like be able to hold the multiple perspectives of like that this is exactly what needs to happen on some level because it's happening, and like, wow, the ways that humans are doing harm to each other and me being part of that, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like so tenderizing. And it
Hmm.
really is what cooks the soul, right? In the alternative path is like to be willing to be in that space of like dissolution and like, you know, so much of the victim, the drama triangle, right? It's like we just ping pong around that. And what brings people into the empowerment dynamics of relating is taking personal responsibility. And I think that's
Hmm.
really what I keep coming back to is like, can I take complete responsibility for my actions and my impact moment by moment, even when that means there's an uncomfortable reveal, right? And I
Yes.
stay with that and commit to that. And then there's going to be grief, there's going to be discomfort, but it also cracks my heart open, which is like an exquisite thing that allows me to actually be connected to others. And like, we get so siloed if we're not really, I think it's actually a beautiful thing. We call it work, right? And it is in a way, but it's also like a profoundly magical happening that like allows us to really have compassion for the human experience when we play all the different roles on the triangle, and then at a certain point we're like, I'm responsible, right? And we can hold others in that responsibility, but like, yes, we have all of our trauma and programming and conditioning, and in a certain way we didn't choose that, but like, we're awake now, right? We're here, and just as much as we can just own it, that I think is what creates a leader and creates safety. It's like,
Yeah.
there's going to be that process that will never end. Like, we're just in it together, right? So, like, humbling ourselves to learn and receive from another's journey, so I'm just really grateful for this conversation, because it really re-anchored me in like, okay, yeah, let's do the thing.
Yeah, I love that. I call it radical self-ownership, and I want to go back to what you said at the beginning, Fauna, that was just like, that just hit me in my chest of like, the purpose of all relationship is growth, and the benefit is love. And it's not just the love that we're able to give, but the love that we're able to like offer ourselves, that compassion of like, yeah, I fucked up and it's okay. We get to forgive ourselves, like, okay, let's do over, let's have a do-over, and be, even get to the point where we can be playful with it, and just make room for it all to be here. Yeah. Thank you so much for gathering today.
Thank you, Isha.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us.